Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James FULLAM. I'm a researcher from the European Centre for Environment and Human Health at the University of Exeter in the UK. Today I'm going to speak to you about two linked pieces of work that I've been involved with over the last few years, concentrating on street trees. But just before we get into that, this work is part of a larger project called ReGreen. And ReGreen is a pan-European H2020 funded project that is focused on nature-based solutions in urban areas. For those of you that aren't familiar with nature-based solutions, these are solutions that are based on or inspired by natural processes and natural phenomena, and they're used to address societal challenges. And there's many different types of challenges. These could be things like pollution, they could be flood control, climate change adaptation, or issues to do with public health. Just to kind of give you a visual idea of what I'm talking about, these are examples of nature-based solutions in Paris. So you have green roofs, green walls, you have the reinstatement of natural waterways, and you have flood swales there as well. So the nature-based solution that I'm specifically interested in, and I think you probably are too, are street trees. So why did we choose this as the archetypal NBS on which to base our work? We're interested in all types of NBS in ReGreen, but we thought that street trees was just a really good one because people have a universal experience of them, whether that's the presence of street trees or absence of them in their lives. In terms of the co-benefits they deliver, both from the physical health and mental health sides, but also in terms of pollution and shade, and water control. They give many potential co-benefits, which is a feature of nature-based solutions. And they also have a value beyond the easily quantifiable. So what do I mean by that? That means people develop an emotional attachment or a sense of place attachment to trees. Any of you that are listening that are from the UK will be familiar with quite a few major protests in recent years in various cities around the UK at the removal of street trees and badly managed removals, and huge fallouts from these and huge breakdowns of trust between the authorities and the citizens themselves. So it just makes for a really interesting nature-based solution. So the first thing I'm going to speak about today is a more theoretical piece of work that we did towards the start of the project, and that was using systems thinking and causal loop diagrams to try and better understand the role of nature-based solutions in the context of mental health. So any of you that have been involved with large projects, and any type of large project really, whether this is a kind of civil project or an academic project, will know that there's some fairly common challenges, particularly around the initial communication and planning between different stakeholders, trying to get a handle on the common goals of the project. Different stakeholders will have different priorities and different goals, and also trying to figure out issues related to implementation and evaluation before you actually start the project. So one of the ways that we were interested in meeting these challenges, or at least being able to communicate across the different stakeholders involved in the nature-based solution, was to use a thing called systems thinking. So systems thinking is really just another way of communicating and thinking about complex interventions. It's based on understanding how things operate within a larger system and the context that that system operates within. And where its value lies is that it offers a good way to kind of envision things like multiple outcomes, feedback loops, and unexpected or unintended consequences. Causal loop diagrams are just one of the tools that are available to you in systems thinking, and that's a very small example of one there just in the center of your screen. That is a causal loop diagram of birth weight, and shows a reinforcing loop: higher birth rate, higher population. That's at its most simplistic. One of the more valuable things about causal loop diagrams is that once you have, fed the model and completed them, you will hopefully end up with what are called some systems archetypes. And these are generic structures or patterns that help you to explain unintended outcomes or counterintuitive outcomes. And these are really valuable when you start to, think about planning your evaluation of an NBS intervention or any complex intervention, really. So this is what a causal loop diagram looks like in reality, and this is just an example from another piece of work on a re-wetting of a wetland in the Netherlands and how this might impact on human health. I'm not an expert in causal loop diagrams or systems thinking, and I'm not assuming any of you are either. So, if this looks a bit crazy and complex to you, believe me, it does to me too. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what they actually look like. So another way to kind of think about causal loop diagrams is to think about the type of question you're asking. So instead of asking a traditional question in the context of street trees, so say asking, do street trees improve mental health? System thinking would ask it in a different way, and they would ask, how may street trees impact and interact with the underlying system around mental health? And that underlying system around mental health, we were looking to be able to use the work of some previous experts in systems thinking. And this is what a depression system looks like. So this is the one that we used as our kind of base model or map for mental health. We adjusted it, but this is a causal loop diagram that was developed for depression specifically. In terms of our process of building one for street trees and mental health, we pulled all of the empirical evidence that we could get our hands on, so a mix of qualitative, quantitative work. We also carried out some expert interviews as part of the work, and then extracted all this data, put it into tables and fields, and then built a map out from there. I'm just giving a very brief overview today. Obviously, there is a paper for this work, and I'll have a link for it at the end of the presentation. So we wanted to build out from the underlying mental health causal loop diagram and include a street tree system on top of this and interacting with this, and where the pathways might interact, so where things about street trees might serve to improve mental health or where they might serve to create a risk to a population's mental health. So this is what that actually looks like in practice. Again, I know it looks extremely complex and overwhelming, and if you're interested, I would refer you to the paper. But again, just to give you an idea of what these causal loop diagrams actually look like, and you'll see the various reinforcing loops. The pluses and minuses in there are directions of the relationships, or the polarity of the relationships, and you also have the ability to build in time delays and things like that. We don't have them in this model. We do have them in this model, excuse me. They're there in between the tree health and the number of trees. Those two tramlines there are a delayed onset effect relationship. So where is the value in this? Really, the value in these maps is that it helps you to generate complex hypotheses, or generate hypotheses that can then be empirically tested. So this is just an example of one. We have quite a few sample hypotheses out of this, but one of the ones that came out of our model is that for street trees to impact mental health, the health of themselves is critical. Excuse me, the health of the trees themselves is critical. And one of the really interesting things about that is that when you look at the model, you identify one of these archetypes that I mentioned earlier, and this is a fixes that fail systems archetype. So you see this quite often in complex interventions where the intention is good. And in the example of street trees, the intention would be to plant new trees in a deprived area. But actually, without the resources to maintain these trees, tree health will suffer, and you'll end up with a worse scenario than you did in the first place. And all this fix serves to do is actually exacerbate inequality in trees in low socioeconomic status neighborhoods, and have a concurrent effect potentially on the mental health and physical health of the residents of those places. So that's just an example of one of the hypotheses. Again, this is, kind of what it looked like while we were building the causal loop diagram. It's extremely complex at certain stages. There's quite a degree of subjectivity to building out on them. So it was very useful for us. It was a useful exercise because we were able to bring in all of the data and we were able to bring in the opinions of various experts in the area. But it was quite an intensive process. And just in terms of reflecting and looking back on it, on whether it was a useful process, it was. Would we do it again? Maybe. Um, but it is a good way to communicate with different partners, particularly with non-academic partners. Once you kind of had the time to explain how the causal loop diagrams work, it's a good way of kind of people seeing the inputs and outputs of these types of interventions. It does not provide any answers, these causal loop diagrams, but they do generate interesting hypotheses. And these hypotheses, I just gave the example there of the one around tree maintenance, are things that should be built into kind of more complex evaluation and thinking about the unintended consequences of these types of interventions at a very early stage. So that's just a very, very brief oversight of our work on causal loop diagrams and street trees. And as I said, I'll show a link to the paper at the end if you'd like to dive into that a little more deeply. So moving on to the kind of second piece of work that we carried out as part of this project. And this piece of work is also focused on street trees, but a quite different type of project. So this project was a qualitative piece of research, and the question that we were interested in answering was, how do urban residents experience perceived street trees in the context of mental health? So to do this, we use something called photo elicitation focus groups. A lot of you will have hopefully heard of focus groups, or they may be called workshops in other settings. But a photo elicitation focus group or workshop is based on the premise that you insert some photographs into the session. For our piece of work, all of the focus groups are carried out online. Originally, we planned to do them in person, but COVID a couple of years ago had different ideas, so we switched to an online format. But we were still able to use the photos, and how this actually looked in practice was the putting up a collage of photos of street trees from various cities, and we would base our conversations around those photographs, or at least use them to kind of guide or inspire the discussions. And why use photographs? Well, photos, people have a very different type of reaction to photos. It stirs different emotions, it stirs different memories and different feelings. And you end up getting a quite different type of data using this than just using a kind of a verbal exchange. For this piece of work, we carried out focus groups in 3 cities in Europe. We refer to these as urban living labs, which is just a fancy name for the kind of exemplar cities that we focused our work on as part of the Regreen project. And these were Paris in France, Velika Gorica in Croatia, and Aarhus in Denmark. So three quite different sized cities, and cities at various stages of development. So I wouldn't kind of say that we could directly compare the results using, with such a small sample of people and only a couple of focus groups, but nice to have, quite a diversity of city type and city space, or cityscape, excuse me. So we did these focus groups. There was 6 in total. We did 2 per city, 4 to 8 participants per group, and the discussions generally lasted around an hour and a half. And in a couple of cities, in Aarhus and in Paris, we were able to include some urban planners in the work, as well as we had the resource and contact to do so, which was really interesting to have them as part of the discussions as well. So again, just to kind of give you an idea of what this looked like in practice, we put up collage like this, using photographs that our partners in the various cities had taken for us. And we would start out the conversation asking people to kind of share their feelings about the photographs, and their reactions to them, and then kind of a series of questions getting kind of more and more geared towards their experience and their community experiences of street trees and how they might play a role in their mental health and the mental health of their peers and the other residents in the cities. So I'm going to give you an example of a couple of themes, and just, there'll be a few quotes in here as well. These are just the findings. Again, this is a very brief overview of the findings. and we'll hope to publish this work in the next 3 or 4 months. Um, but yeah, just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of things that we found from these focus groups. There was a really interesting themes around seasons and sense of place, and I think this is mainly related to kind of the positive experience of street trees and how they might impact on mental health in a positive way. So many people, or in all of the cities, we had this feedback about how street trees allowed them to follow the seasons, and that was really valuable to them. Another thing was this idea of sense of place, and how people develop an attachment to trees. And this was also really clear, and it was something that helped people stay grounded in their place and almost in their childhoods. There was a sense of continuity throughout their lives from these, from specific trees, which is kind of one of the really interesting. Um, Another interesting theme that arose was that of security, and this is not so much in the kind of positive impacts or potential positive impacts on mental health. This is more so to do with issues of feeling safe in your city, and how certain groups or certain subgroups may or may not feel that safe depending on how trees are placed and trees are managed. So the one kind of interesting quote there at the top, this idea of the good green, the rich green, and the bad green. And I think there's a kind of misconception that wealthy areas are generally leafy and treed and well looked after. But the converse can also be true. Very deprived areas can also have lots of trees. They can be very green spaces because of neglect and other issues. So, this idea that trees are good and trees are always good, I think it's important that we not fight against that, but that we are critical of that idea, and that we accept that not all trees are good all the time, and that not everybody loves trees. And especially speaking to the urban planners as part of this, they were inundated with complaints about trees for a multitude of reasons. And unlike when you see media coverage of protests against street tree removal, it's very rare that actually it makes it into the public realm, that there's quite a lot of kind of complaints and disbenefits behind the scenes that we don't figure out. So it's important to acknowledge these as part of the process of kind of encouraging street trees as a nature-based solution. I've kind of touched on it already, but another of the interesting themes is that of us versus them, and indeed us versus us. And what do I mean by that? I mean that street trees have a really strong potential to create division within cities, and we've seen it in Sheffield, and we've seen it in Plymouth in the UK in recent times. But even just generally during our focus groups, there was a real sense developed that the citizens were for trees and the authorities most definitely weren't, even though in the reality that isn't the case at all. It's very much a questions of resource and trade-off. There are genuine conflicts and there are genuine mismanagement of these issues, but the reflections that we encountered were really this sense of division, and how it created this us versus them way of thinking between the citizens and the authorities, and this was present in all the cities. And I'll give you a little minute just to read the quotes there. I know there's a little bit of text on that screen, but just to kind of give you an idea of what I mean by us versus them and us versus us. So hopefully that's giving you a chance just to get through them. The slides will be available afterwards, of course. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of just an idea of some of the themes that arose from this work. I'm still doing the analysis on these things, and would hope to kind of hope to get it published in the next coming months. But in terms of just the general reflections on this, I think what our strong learnings, or some of the important points, were that city residents, they are not naive to the trade-offs of living in urban settings. They know that nature in cities is nature that's adapted to the needs of the city and the needs of the populace. There's often nothing very natural about it. but they understand this and still value it. But they also recognize that there's resource constraints within cities, and that cities have to manage their budgets ever more carefully, and that at times there will be priorities that come ahead of trees in the neighborhoods. You know, if your streets aren't clean, then you're not going to be all that worried about street trees in the first place. As we looked at on the last slide there's a huge potential for the damage of trust between council, municipalities and citizens when street tree removal and indeed street tree planting is mismanaged, and the creation of tension between citizens themselves in different neighborhoods. And this is, I think, kind of one of the factors that really has a potential to impact on the mental health or the well-being of the city populaces. You know, there's enough tension in today's world without adding to it. And then finally, one of the really important findings was that residents value mature trees and mature stock to a much higher degree. And this for a variety of reasons. You know, there's the aesthetics, there's the sense of place and continuity of establishment throughout a person's lives, and also I think, you know, the general public are probably more aware, more informed of the ecosystem services that are provided by street trees than, you know, we as academics may assume in the first place. I think I was certainly surprised by the knowledge. Maybe I shouldn't have been. But I think, you know, this valuing of mature stock is something that needs to be borne in mind by all municipalities and councils as they kind of make decisions with regard to development. So yeah, that is main reflections on that, and that brings me to a close today. So I'd just like to acknowledge some of my fellow colleagues on this project, Miriam, Joe, and Connie. And if you're interested in reading the paper about causal loop diagrams, if you just take a photo of that little QR code, that should bring you straight to it. And thank you very much for listening to me today. And I should be about to take a couple of questions if there are any. So thank you very much.